I am 30 years old, and I work in the construction business. My job takes up nearly all my time, but it allows me to live a luxurious life. A nice apartment, an expensive car, vacations twice a year, and no debts. I have a wife, and we've been... I have a wife, and we've been together for 4 years. She is 5 years younger than me, a beautiful and well-kept woman. She always knows how to present herself. Her hair is perfect, her skin radiant, her nails and makeup flawless, like something out of a glossy magazine. She doesn't work, and there's no need for her to haul. I've always said she can do whatever she wants at home, as long as she's happy. As far as I know, her days are filled with meeting friends, shopping, gym sessions, and trips to beauty salons. This seemed normal, even logical to me. If I could provide for her, why shouldn't she enjoy herself? But I began to notice that she wasn't always satisfied. She often complained that I worked too much, that we spent our evenings apart. When I tried to explain that without my work, all this comfort wouldn't exist, she would just roll her eyes. It felt like I was talking to someone who didn't want to listen. We argued more often than I would have liked, but I tried not to dwell on it. After all, don't all couples fight? However, one argument stood out. It started when she asked in the morning if I was planning to take a day off to spend with her. At that moment, I was reviewing a report, my head spinning with thoughts about a new construction project, delays from suppliers, and workers demanding raises. I brushed her off, saying it wasn't possible today because I had too much to do. Evening would only get worse. When I got home that night, she didn't come to the door to greet me. She was sitting in the living room, glued to her phone. I tried to start a conversation, but she was cold and distant. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, she said that I treated her like she was invisible, that she didn't feel loved. I replied that I didn't understand what she was missing. We had everything anyone could wish for. In response, she smirked and said a phrase that still echoes in my head: money can't replace care. After that, I couldn't hold back. I grabbed my keys and left, slamming the door behind me. The next morning, I left for work earlier than usual. She didn't see me off, which was wuss. Another sign, but I decided not to make a big deal out of it. Let her cool off. A few hours later, she called me. Her voice panicked, saying there was a burst pipe and water was leaking everywhere. I was in a meeting and couldn't leave right away, so I told her to get the number for a plumber from the concierge. Honestly, I didn't think much of it. A pipe burst. It wasn't the end of the world. We'd dealt with similar problems before. Later, I found out how things unfolded. Plumber, she called, lived in our building. Apparently, his name was Ivan. I'd heard about him before, a stocky guy with a cocky attitude who was quite popular with some of the neighbors. At the time, it didn't even cross my mind that this detail might be important. I was sure I had done the right thing. Sure, maybe I could have gone home. But my work was for us, for her. That day was long and exhausting. I was stuck with contractors, discussing one of the most complicated projects, trying to find additional resources to keep the project on track. By the time her call crossed my mind again, it felt distant, unimportant. I figured she'd handled it. After all, she's an adult. Calling a plumber isn't the hardest task in the world. I came home close to 9 p.m., stopping at a gas station to buy coffee and collect my thoughts before heading back. I thought about her again and hoped her mood had improved. Maybe she'd appreciate the gesture if I bought her favorite flowers. It seemed like a good way to smooth things over after our morning argument. So, I quickly grabbed a bouquet of white lilies and headed home. When I opened the door, she met me at the entrance. She looked as if nothing had happened. She was wearing a bathrobe, her face clean of makeup, her hair slightly damp, as if she'd just showered everything and didn't bring it up again. At the time, I didn't suspect anything. I went to the bathroom and noticed the floor mat was damp, and there was still a faint smell of wet fabric. I assumed she had been cleaning towels or rags and decided not to ask questions. Exhaustion outweighed my curiosity. Later, we had dinner. I tried to be attentive, asking her about her day. She answered briefly, mechanically. Usually, she loved sharing stories about her friends or activities, but this time, Her responses felt rehearsed. It seemed odd, but I chalked it up to lingering tension from our argument. Her mood only seemed to improve when I gave her the flowers. She smiled, but the smile felt forced, as if hiding something. The next few days passed without major incidents, immersed in work, and she went back to her usual routine. Life seemed to return to normal, but I started noticing small changes. She spent more time locked in the bathroom with her phone, whispering into it. Her usual gym sessions and outings with friends started lasting longer. One day, I even joked, "Isn't that a bit too much coffee with your friends?" She just shrugged and changed the subject. Then, a few days later, I came home early due to a canceled meeting. The faint smell of men's cologne greeted me, a scent I didn't recognize. I knew for sure no friends or family had been over. An hour later, she came back, cheerful, carrying boutique shopping bags. When I asked who had been at the house, she immediately replied, "Ivan stopped by to check the pipes again. You know we have to make sure everything's in order after the leak." Her explanation sounded plausible, but something in her tone and the way she quickly changed the subject made me uneasy. At that moment, I still didn't know the full picture, but one thing was clear: our relationship was changing, and not for the better. The following days seemed ordinary on the surface, but I couldn't shake the growing sense that something was wrong, trying to find solace and stability there. But in hindsight, that was my biggest mistake. I thought if I worked harder, I could distract myself and avoid the gnawing doubts in my mind. A week passed, and everything seemed to go back to normal. At least on the surface. We talked like we used to, but I could feel something had changed. She seemed more detached than usual. I tried to be attentive. I brought her flowers, suggested dinners at her favorite restaurants, and tried to bridge the gap between us. She responded politely, thanking me, but behind her words, there was something I couldn't put my finger on. A hidden wall I couldn't break through. That week, I bought her a new phone. She'd been hinting for a while that her old one needed replacing, and I thought this would cheer her up. She seemed genuinely happy and even appeared to perk up a bit, but something about her joy felt overly exaggerated, like she was trying to distract me from an internal conflict. From then on, she started spending even more time on her phone, laughing at something, scrolling through feeds, messaging. Sometimes she'd go to another room to talk. I told myself that she, like any other person, was entitled to her privacy, but this behavior wasn't typical for her. She used to enjoy sharing who she was talking to and what they discussed, but now there was only silence. One evening, she casually mentioned that the faucet in the bathroom had started dripping again. My guard went up internally, but I didn't let it show. She brought up the possibility of calling the plumber again. Exhausted from work and not wanting to deal with another mundane household issue, I nodded and said, Call whoever you need to get it fixed." At the time, I didn't even consider that this might be an excuse for something else. The next day, I had to stay late at work and didn't return home until close to midnight. When I arrived, she was already home, but she looked tired. She said she'd spent the whole day dealing with the faucet issue and had to call the plumber Ivan again to figure out what the problem was. I nodded, not wanting to escalate the situation, but I couldn't shake her eye, feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence. She didn't seem to notice my growing suspicions and continued living as she normally did. Morning workouts, coffee with friends, shopping trips. I started observing her more closely, trying to figure out what was going on in her head. Did she have any real feelings for me anymore? Or was she only staying because of the comfort I provided? One evening, I came home to find her looking far too put together for a normal day. She replied that she was heading to a beauty salon and then meeting a friend. I nodded and didn't press further, but something inside me broke. I didn't know how to stop what was happening. That night, while she slept, I stayed up searching the internet for surveillance cameras. It was the most unpleasant moment of my life. I felt like a traitor, violating her privacy. But I needed to know the truth. I couldn't live with the doubt eating away at me from the inside. Something had to give. After that night, everything changed for me. I could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. Every move she made, Every glance filled me with suspicion. I began noticing things I hadn't before, like how she'd suddenly receive calls and step into another room, or how she'd smile at her phone, a smile different from the ones I was used to. It was a smile of satisfaction, as though she was holding on to a secret that no one, especially me, should know. The cameras I ordered arrived the same day. They were small, with wide-angle lenses and nearly invisible. That evening, while she was at the beauty salon, I installed them. I placed one in the living room. Another in the kitchen, and a third in the bedroom. I made sure they were discreet and wouldn't disrupt what little trust remained between us. Deep down, I still hoped I was wrong, that my suspicions were baseless, a product of my stress and overwork. The next day, I left for work with a strange sense of relief. Now I had a way to uncover the truth. If I was wrong, the cameras would confirm it, and I could finally put my doubts to rest. But if I wasn't, well, then I'd have to make decisions I wasn't ready to face. Throughout the day, I checked the camera feed several times. There was nothing unusual. She went about her routine, talking on the phone, drinking coffee. Everything seemed perfectly normal. For a moment, I felt foolish, as though I had created a problem where there was none. Recordings. That's when I saw him. Ivan. He arrived around noon. She met him at the door as if she had been expecting him. She looked well-groomed but not overly done up. Light makeup, slightly tousled hair. Ivan entered, and they went straight to the bathroom. The camera didn't capture audio, but their body language made it clear they weren't discussing plumbing. He leaned in playfully, and she laughed, lightly pushing him away. Minutes later, they moved to the living room. I watched as she placed coffee in front of him and sat down next to him. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but then my heart sank as I saw her place her hand on his shoulder. He turned to her, said something, and she smiled. Looking flustered but not pulling away. Then, it happened. He leaned in, and she didn't move back. Their kiss was brief, but it was enough to make my hands tremble. Moments later, they got up and went to the bedroom. I slammed the laptop shut and sat in silence, staring at the wall. It was all clear now. There was no more room for doubt. My wife, the woman I had provided everything for, the one I had shared my life with, was cheating on me with that smug plumber. Why? What had I done wrong? I searched for reasons, excuses, but found nothing but emptiness. When she came into the room later, she acted like everything was normal, smiling, and asking what I was working on. I struggled to meet her gaze. Her behavior seemed so ordinary, so normal, that I barely restrained myself from asking, "How could you?" But I knew it wasn't the time. I had a plan, and I needed to stick to it. The next morning, I woke up before she did. She was still peacefully sleeping, wrapped up in the blanket as though nothing had happened. I sat there watching her, trying to understand what was going on in her mind. Was she satisfied with herself? Did she feel any guilt? Or was this all just a game to her? The thought that the person I had loved and trusted could betray me so easily, so cynically, was incomprehensible. At work, I was like a ghost. My colleagues spoke to me, asked questions, but I could barely hear them. My mind was elsewhere, consumed by thoughts of her and him, of their kisses, their glances, their touch. I knew I couldn't turn a blind eye to this any longer, but what was I supposed to do? Should I confront her directly, create a scene, end everything immediately? Or should I wait, gather more evidence, and decide once I was certain of every detail? These questions swirled in my head as I tried to focus on blueprints and budgets. That evening, I returned home earlier than usual. She was in the kitchen, doing something as if nothing was out of the ordinary. She asked about my day, and I responded curtly, my tone dry, trying not to let my emotions show. I needed more time to think. Inside, I was torn between the urge to confront her and the need to stay calm and collected. We had dinner in near silence. She didn't seem to notice my tension. chatting about her friends and her plans for the weekend. I listened, but my thoughts were elsewhere, focused on the cameras and what they might reveal next. When she announced that she was going to take a bath, I felt a wave of relief. As soon as the phone to beat, okay, but mein fingwa, be short. Bathroom door closed behind her. I grabbed my laptop and opened the camera app. The day's recordings were uneventful at first. She went about her routine, talking on the phone, drinking coffee. Nothing suspicious, but then I noticed something. Around 2 p.m., she had a long video call. The camera didn't capture the screen of her phone, but her gestures, her smiles, her body language made it clear she was talking to someone she liked. She laughed, bit her lip nervously, and laughed, bit her lip nervously, played with her hair, all of the little details that screamed flirtation. It was him. I was sure of it. My fist clenched so hard it hurt. Her behavior left no doubt. She looked like a teenager in love, someone who was just starting to date. That realization made my blood boil. By the time she came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a fluffy bathrobe, looking relaxed and content, I had already closed the laptop. She had no idea what I'd seen. We exchanged a few casual words before she went to bed, saying she was tired. The next morning, I told her I would be staying late at work. She just nodded, almost as if it was convenient for her. As soon as I left the house, I went to a store and bought a new, higher quality camera, one that recorded sound. If my suspicions were correct and she invited him over again, I needed undeniable proof. I installed the new camera that evening under the pretense of fixing some wiring. She didn't question it, and I headed to the office the next day, though my mind was once again focused on what might be happening at home. 2 days later, the moment I had dreaded finally came. I left the house early, telling her I had a meeting with a client that would run late. Expected. She seized the opportunity. Around midday, I checked the camera feed from my phone. She was pacing nervously around the apartment, her phone constantly in her hand. Then, the doorbell rang. He walked in like he owned the place. She led him to the living room, and I watched as they talked, laughed, and had coffee together. Their body language left no room for doubt. She was completely comfortable with him, even flirty. He leaned closer to her, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him with that same coquettish smile I used to think was meant for me. I couldn't watch anymore. I closed the app, my hands shaking with anger and bitterness. It felt like a punch to the gut. I had given her everything: comfort, stability, love. And this was how she repaid me. At that moment, I knew I couldn't take it anymore. The next morning, I felt an eerie sense of calm. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only cold determination. There would be no more attempts to salvage the relationship. No explanations. No second chances. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. She woke up as usual, made herself coffee, and sat scrolling through her phone, smiling at something. She even mentioned plans for the day, a trip to the beauty salon, and a meeting with friends. She was completely unaware that this would be a turning point. As soon as she left, I sprang into action. First, I gathered all her belongings: clothes, shoes, bags, cosmetics. Everything that was hers. I packed it all into large garbage bags. Every sweater, every pair of shoes. I filled the bags with the sense that I was removing not just her possessions, but her presence from my life. By the time I was done, the closets contained only my things. It was as if she had never lived there. I called a moving service and asked them to take everything to the trash bins on a nearby street. They didn't ask questions. They just did the job. Within an hour, there was nothing of hers left in my apartment, except memories, which I planned to erase just as thoroughly. Next, I changed the locks. I called a locksmith I knew, who arrived quickly and replaced the locks, handing me new keys. I looked at the door and felt a wave of relief. She wouldn't be able to come back as if nothing had happened. Finally, I dealt with finances. She didn't have her own income. All her expenses were covered by me. I blocked her access to our joint account and canceled the credit card she used. No more salons, no more coffee shops, no more anything, at least not on my dime. When that was done, I sat down with my laptop and edited the footage from the cameras. I compiled a short video showing her interactions with him, her flirtations, their kisses, his visits, her happy smiles. It was painful and humiliating, but I knew it had to be done. I wanted her to see herself, to understand that I was no longer the naive fool she could deceive. I sent the video to her with a short message. This is the end. Your things are on the street, the locks are changed, and the cards are blocked. Good luck. Then I turned off my phone. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her pleas, or worse, her accusations. I was done with her lies. After turning off my phone, I sat there in the silence of the now empty old Bieren's apartment. The absence of her presence was palpable. No sound of her laughter, no scent of her perfume, no light footsteps echoing in the hall. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly alone. But it wasn't loneliness that consumed me. It was a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. I had severed the bond that had once tied us together, but I knew it would take time to fully process what had happened. To clear my head, I decided to reach out to some friends. Mo suggested we meet up at a sauna, a tradition we had occasionally indulged in to unwind. They were surprised by my sudden invitation but agreed without asking too many questions. I didn't tell them about what had happened. I wasn't ready to share my pain, not even with those closest to me. I needed time to digest it on my own. Hours. I managed to laugh and forget, even if only briefly. But every so often, my thoughts would drift back to her. I questioned myself. How had it come to this? Were we ever truly happy? Or had I been blind to the cracks forming in our relationship? Had her dissatisfaction grown slowly? Or had it been there all along, waiting to surface? That night, I returned to the apartment, feeling physically drained but emotionally clearer. Spaces where her things used to be were no longer reminders of what I had lost, but symbols of a clean slate, a life that was now solely mine to shape. The next few days were quiet. I focused on work, pouring my energy into projects that had been on the back burner. I made an effort to reconnect with friends and family, who welcomed me with open arms, even if they didn't yet know the full story. I wasn't ready to explain everything to them, but their presence reminded me that I wasn't alone. One day, out of curiosity, I turned my phone back on. As expected, there were dozens of missed calls and messages from her. Some were angry, others pleading, and a few full of apologies and promises to change. I didn't open any of them to them. I didn't need to. I had already made my decision, and no words could undo what I had seen or repair the damage she had done to my trust. Weeks turned into months, and gradually, I began to rebuild my life. I took up new hobbies, explored interests I had neglected during our relationship, and even started traveling alone. Something I had always wanted to do, but never found the time for. With every step forward, the pain and bitterness faded, replaced by a sense of empowerment and freedom. As for her, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had struggled to adjust. She tried to contact me several more times, even sending letters, but I never responded. Eventually, she stopped. Perhaps she stopped. Perhaps she realized that there was no point. The chapter of my life that included her was closed. Looking back now, I see the experience as a painful but necessary turning point. It taught me the importance of self-respect and the value of honesty in a relationship. Most importantly, it reminded me that my happiness shouldn't depend on someone else's approval or presence. Life goes on as it always does. And while the scars of betrayal remain, they no longer define me. I've learned to live me with them, to accept them as part of my story, but not the whole story. And for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. The silence in my apartment is no longer empty. It's full of possibilities. And that, to me, is freedom.